Okay, so for this lesson, we're going to look at how the changing perceptions and value of Bollywood over time has led to the acceptance or the rejection of Bollywood through different groups. So most of this content that we're going to go over should be fairly familiar to you at this point. Just going to look at it in the focus of who's accepting it, who's rejecting it, and how that's connected to the changing values and perceptions of Bollywood. So as we know, the government initially with Mahatma Gandhi and the Rahithian ideal viewed the cinema as being vulgar and catering for uneducated masses, as Mahatma Gandhi was antithetic to cinema and viewed it with other vices like gambling. So he saw it as being a sinful technology. So clearly did not value Bollywood at that time, and therefore viewed it as being very sinful and not valuable to society at all. And so because of that, and Prime Minister Nehru as well opposed the content in Bollywood. So he was the first Prime Minister from 1947 to 64 of the newly established Indian independent government. He saw cinema as being its value of being used for education purposes, so therefore he saw far greater stress in Bollywood as being laid on a type of film which presumably is supposed to be entertaining. So he saw Bollywood as just being an entertaining kind of leisure activity rather than an educational or a valuable venture, and therefore the combination of this, of it being viewed as sinful and a desire for it to be educational and not entertainment, led to greater taxation and censorship. So restricting Bollywood and promoting serious filmmaking, which is up until the 1980 National Film Development Corporation, which was a government-established film corporation which produced films which they saw as being of value to Indian society. So this created a culturally ambivalent attitude among intellectuals in the middle class towards Bollywood. So definitely early on in Bollywood's filmmaking, most of the viewers were the poorer groups within India, which to the most extent was good for Bollywood because they were the masses, and therefore they were the group that would be potentially giving them the most revenue, except for the purchasing of paraphernalia, which they didn't really have the funds and means in which to do. But outside of that, definitely that's why Bollywood appealed to the masses at that time as well, because that was their main audiences. And so therefore having some influence over definitely who was consuming and how people were consuming Bollywood as well. However, the changing value of Bollywood by the government and the changing perceptions of Bollywood by the government is definitely seen through the granting of industry status in the 1998 by the government, which has given great economic recognition to Bollywood film, which has allowed for it to be seen as a major industry, which has an influence on the value and the perception of Bollywood with the wealthy class, especially the diaspora as well as within India, as it's got greater funding. There's greater involvement of businesses within Bollywood since the industry status has been granted, which therefore increases the value of Bollywood within these groups and therefore acceptance. So, and we can also see that through the changing content of Bollywood. Now that these groups are accepting Bollywood, their content is focused at targeting those groups as well, and that's where we see that shift in the wealthy Indians being represented within the Bollywood films. And so there's definitely been an increase in acceptance based on this changing government value of Bollywood, and therefore allowing greater content to be displayed as well as the granting of industry status. Media has, as we know, has always had a symbiotic relationship. So it's always been connected to, what films are being made, and Bollywood has also allowed for revenue streams to grow in media. As we've seen, they kind of work together to support each other. However, this has not always been the case, as media was initially viewed as opposition, because it would usually stream illegal and pirated copies of films on TV, which would remove the revenue, say, sales of, I spelled sales wrong there, sales of the producers within the cinema. And so they were really concerned because they weren't getting paid for their films to be screened on TV. And so they were really concerned about what kind of impact the media would have on the revenue streams of Bollywood films themselves. However, as we know, this has shifted, and now they have a really clear, closely connected, symbiotic relationship. And so there's greater acceptance of media of Bollywood as well as of Bollywood of media. So as we know, it relies heavily on Bollywood for content on TV, as we saw through the Stars game shows that they're involved in, the showing of the films, and as well as the music within Bollywood for shows like MTV. So media definitely strongly relies on Bollywood to increase its revenue, and then vice versa. What that does is it increases the revenue of Bollywood films. As we know, it builds hype and interest, and so there's and that kind of clear acceptance of Bollywood within the media is definitely enhancing the perception and value of Bollywood itself, because it perpetuates those myths of the stars as well as the internal mythologies within the films, and then therefore builds hype and demand and interest for the content. However, the ease of access and cost of watching the films on your TV and not really like paying a small fee for the cable access, and the constant streaming of different films, throughout the month, is having an impact on consumption in cinema. People within India are more so increasingly only going to see a smaller amount of films within the cinemas, and so therefore impacting on the revenue that the producers are able to receive, because if they're not really into the film, or if it hasn't captured their interests and their demands as much as through the distribution that they've had, then they're less likely to go and watch it because they might just be able to see it on TV. So media is having an impact on the acceptance of some Bollywood films, but not the acceptance of Bollywood overall. For the most part, that is driving interest and desire for Bollywood rather than taking away. But to some extent, it is impacting on a couple of films. Filmy, as we know, which is the music within Bollywood films, is also greatly involved in the acceptance of Bollywood. As we know, it drives up hype and interest within the films, and it's very popular with Indian audiences as well as diasporic audiences. And this can be seen through the mass exodus of all Indian radio when music rights were refused. So people stopped listening to all Indian radio when Bollywood refused to give the radio station its license to play the songs from the films, and so people stopped listening to the radio station. So that's a clear indication of how much Indians love the filmy or the songs from the Bollywood films, and so that definitely plays a massive role in driving acceptance of Bollywood at the films as well as the paraphernalia associated with it. So as we know, Indian audiences' perceptions of Bollywood have shifted over time as they see Bollywood as being more driven or more targeting towards diasporic audiences rather than their own. And so they're very concerned about the growing Western influences and how that's kind of representing a shift in Indian values, and they don't like that. So that's definitely growing concerns for Indian groups. And this can be seen from the kind of shift in family loyalty. So the growth in focusing on the individual desires rather than the family desires, the movement away from painting Western society as well as businesses as villains, as well as focusing on the corrupt state. Most films now don't really paint Western or businesses as villains, nor do they really focus on the government and what it's doing in society. They don't kind of focus on those national issues. They've more moved to those global issues, and because of that, that's definitely changing the value Bollywood has had within these Indian viewing groups. Also, we can see that through the increasing focus on wealth and materialism, as well as the explicit social content. So all of this kind of combined together has definitely shifted the value of Bollywood for Indians within India. They're definitely seeing it as being less reflective of their lives and more reflective of global Indian lives, or just global lives entirely. And so that's definitely leading to some rejection of Bollywood, as it's seen as being incongruous with the majority of Indian experiences. This is definitely the case. We can see that with hybrid Indian Western films like the 2004 Bride and Prejudice. It was a massive flop in India, but it grew or had massive acceptance or critically acclaimed in countries like Britain and Australia. So it was very popular in Britain and Australia and not really popular at all within India. And so we can see that the more highly westernized films is definitely being rejected within India, as we saw previously in the last lesson. Films like Brahman Naman, which was that film about the Indian boys wanting to have sex or lose their virginity. That's definitely more highly westernized and therefore more rejected by Indian audiences. However, the maintaining of the Bollywood or Indianness seen through the spectacle, as well as the music and the internal mythologies, as well as the use of external mythologies. So the continuation of these things that make Bollywood Bollywood is maintaining acceptance of Bollywood within Indian audiences. So they're more likely to reject some films, the ones that are seen to be very highly westernized, rather than rejecting all films. So this growing concern of Bollywood being reflective of not their lives but others is only targeted to certain films. It's not a blanket view of Bollywood overall, and that's definitely because of the maintaining of these Indian or Indianness or Bollywood styles that maintains the drive and the demand for Bollywood films within India. And then lastly, the diasporic audiences, as well as just global Western audiences overall. We can see just through the sheer demand of Bollywood that the value and perception of Bollywood being reflective of their lives and of being of interest to them has increased over time. And this is especially for the case for the diasporic audiences. As we know, Bollywood is seen as being that means and that way for them to connect to their culture and to their nation. And so the value of Bollywood for diasporic audiences is massive as well. And so this can be seen through the screening of Bollywood films in film festivals like Cannes and Venice, as well as popular screenings within cinemas like London, New York and Sydney. So several cinemas throughout Sydney will regularly play Bollywood films, generally films that were popular in India, so that had big screenings in India. They'll tend to show those as well. So that we can definitely see that kind of value for Indian culture within Bollywood films is definitely what's driving interest to watch the films as well. And we can see that that kind of growth in value and perceptions of Bollywood, and therefore the increasing acceptance of Bollywood through pretty much from the 1990s onwards. And that's because Bollywood films have frequently listed Bollywood films have been frequently listed in UK weekly top grossing films from the 1990s. So the desire for diasporic audiences to see these Bollywood films has definitely increased from this period. Also, the increasing Western audiences is evidenced by the popularity of films like Bride and Prejudice, as well as demands for traditional Bollywood films. So Western audiences, as we've discussed, still want to see Indian values within Bollywood films, because that's what makes it Bollywood, is that kind of representation of Indian lifestyle and Indian values. However, they definitely also want to feel a connection and an understanding in the films, and so there's still that growing demand for more Western lifestyles, Western values, as well as a combination of Indian values, which, as we know, the more that increases, the more the Indian audiences will reject the popular culture. So Bollywood is definitely running that fine line at the moment of appealing to diasporic audiences while also appealing to Indian audiences. And if they go too much of one of either way, that will definitely lead to a rejection of that film, or of the film itself by these different groups. And that's why we see these kind of variation in films. Bollywood isn't completely diasporic or isn't completely Western, nor is it completely Indian, and that's because it's trying to appeal to both of these groups. And yeah, as I said, if one film goes too much one way, then it will be rejected by the opposing group. And that's because the value Bollywood has for these different groups and what they want to see within these films definitely influences how much they accept or reject the films themselves.